Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive into tonight's journey, if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's darker corners, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want more of this kind of content. I'm not here to guilt you into anything. Also, drop your city and the current time in the comments below. I love seeing where you all are in the world and who's up late with me, letting history lull them to sleep. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, adjust your pillow, and let's ease into tonight's story together. You think you know how medieval England worked, right? Kings on thrones, nobles in castles, peasants in fields, clean hierarchy, simple power structure. The king says jump, everyone asks how high. That's what the history books tell you, that's the sanitized version they teach in schools. But tonight, we're going to peel back the curtain on something far more interesting, far more corrupt, and infinitely more complicated. Tonight, we're walking into a medieval English town, and we're going to discover who really held the power. Spoiler alert, it wasn't who you think. The truth is darker, greedier, and more violent than any textbook admits. So close your eyes if you want, or keep them half open, and let me paint you a picture of the real medieval England, the one where power was bought, sold, and beaten into submission, where democracy was theatre and justice was whatever the richest man in town said it was. Let's step into that world together. Picture yourself standing in a medieval English town, let's say around the year 1350. You're in the marketplace, cobblestones under your feet, the smell of bread baking mixing with less pleasant odours from the gutters, merchants calling out prices, children running between stalls, somewhere a blacksmith's hammer ringing against an anvil. You've been told your whole life that the king rules this land, that his word is law from London to the Scottish border, from the Welsh mountains to the eastern coast. Royal authority, absolute and unquestionable. The paintings show him crowned and glorious. The stories tell of his power reaching into every corner of his realm. But here's what they don't tell you. The king has probably never set foot in your town. His officials maybe visit once a year, if that. The royal court is weeks away by horseback, and between you and that throne are hundreds of miles of muddy roads, dangerous forests, and people who couldn't care less what some distant monarch thinks about anything. The medieval English monarchy, despite all the pageantry and propaganda, was actually remarkably weak when it came to local control. Kings had armies, sure. They could muster forces for wars and crush major rebellions. But day-to-day governance of the hundreds of towns dotting England, that was someone else's problem. See, medieval England wasn't a unified state the way we think of countries today. It was more like a patchwork quilt of semi-independent territories, each with its own power structure, its own rules, its own little kingdoms within the kingdom. The king's authority existed technically, but it was filtered through so many layers of local power that by the time it reached your town it was barely recognisable. And here's the kicker. The king needed the towns more than the towns needed him. He needed their tax money to fund his wars. He needed their merchant wealth to prop up his treasury. He needed their support when he fought with his barons or invaded France or dealt with whatever crisis erupted this decade. The towns knew this, and they used it. Starting in the 11th and 12th centuries, towns began buying their freedom. Not with blood, with gold. A town would send representatives to the king with an offer. Give us a charter, a royal document granting us the right to govern ourselves, and we'll pay you a massive sum of money, up front, plus annual payments forever. The king, always desperate for cash, would agree. He'd draw up a fancy charter with impressive seals and Latin phrases, and suddenly that town wasn't under the direct control of the local feudal lord anymore. They were technically still part of the kingdom, they still owed the king taxes and troops when required, but internally, they could run themselves however they wanted. This is what they called a charter of freedom. The word freedom is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because it didn't mean freedom for everyone in the town. It meant freedom for the town's elite to govern without interference. Freedom to tax their own people, run their own courts, make their own rules. Freedom from having some nobleman's bailiff poking around in their business. Cities like Bristol, Lincoln, Oxford, Salisbury, they all acquired these charters. London had special status going back to William the Conqueror, who granted the city autonomy in 1075 because he was smart enough to know you don't mess with the richest city in your kingdom. Some towns went even further. They became county corporates, counties of themselves. This meant they weren't just self-governing, they were administratively separate from the surrounding county entirely. They appointed their own sheriffs, ran their own courts, collected their own taxes. They were like city-states inside England. mini-kingdoms where the king's writ technically ran but practically didn't. York became a county corporate in 1396. The mayor of York wasn't just a town official, he acted as a scieta, the person who handled the king's rights to property of people who died without heirs. The 2 sheriffs of York replaced the 3 bailiffs and held courts that previously only royal officials could conduct. The mayor could carry his sword upright everywhere except in the king's actual presence. A small detail, but symbols mattered. That upright sword said, "I have authority here, real authority." The City of London took this to an extreme that persists even today. The corporation of the City of London became so powerful, so wealthy, so politically connected that even kings had to negotiate with it. The monarch technically rules England, but when they want to enter the City of London, they stop at the boundary and wait for the Lord Mayor's permission. It's ceremonial now, but it reflects a very real medieval power dynamic. The city had money, and money meant the king came to them, not the other way around. So forget the image of royal control reaching everywhere. In practical terms, what you had was hundreds of towns running themselves, with their own power structures, their own ruling classes, their own systems of control. The king was far away, distracted by wars and politics. The local lord, if there even was one with authority over the town, had been bought off with the charter payment. Which means the real question isn't who the king appointed to rule your town. The question is, who actually held power once the king's back was turned? Who made the decisions that affected whether you ate or starved, whether you worked or begged, whether you lived free or died in chains? That's what we're here to uncover tonight. Let's talk about the mayor. In your mind, maybe you're picturing an elected official, someone chosen by the people to represent their interests, a servant of the community. That's not what a medieval mayor was. A medieval mayor was more like a merchant king. He was the wealthiest, most powerful trader in town, elected not by the people, but by a tiny circle of other wealthy men who all protected each other's interests. Think of it less as an election, and more as powerful families taking turns. Here's how it actually worked. Each town had a council, usually called the Council of Aldermen or the 24 or something similar. These were the elite, the richest guild masters and merchants, the men who owned the most property and controlled the most trade. When it was time to choose a mayor, these men would meet, probably in some comfortable room above a guild hall where the rest of the town wasn't allowed, and they'd pick one of their own. Sometimes there was a vote. Sometimes it was just understood whose turn it was. Sometimes there was bitter infighting between factions, each representing different economic interests or family alliances. But here's what never happened. Common people didn't get a say. The craftsmen, the labourers, the small shopkeepers, the servants, they weren't in that room. They weren't part of the process. They might be assembled afterward and told to cheer for the new mayor, to give it all a veneer of popular support, but they didn't choose him. In York, which kept detailed records, we can see exactly who became mayor between 1399 and 1509. Out of 88 mayors during that period, 68 were merchants or mercers. That's merchants who dealt in luxury textiles and fine goods. The wealthiest of the wealthy. There were a couple of goldsmiths, a few grocers, the occasional draper or dyer. One glazier made it through. One. The government of York wasn't some diverse representation of the town's population. It was a mercantile oligarchy, a government of by and for the merchant class, and that pattern held true across England. The men who became mayors were the men who controlled trade, who had the most to gain from controlling the town government, who had the wealth to spend time on politics instead of working with their hands. So what did the mayor actually do with all this power? Everything. The mayor was the centre of town government. He presided over courts multiple times per week. Disputes between merchants. The mayor's court. Someone accused of breaking market regulations. Mayor's court. Debt cases. Property disputes. Accusations of theft or assault. The mayor handled it all, usually with the Council of Aldermen sitting beside him as advisors and judges. The mayor represented the town in all dealings with the royal government. When the king sent orders, the mayor received them. When the king wanted money, the mayor negotiated how much. When there were disputes about the town's charter rights, the mayor went to argue their case. He was the face of the town to the outside world. He also convened meetings with sheriffs, aldermen, and other officials. The General Assembly happened once a year after the Feast of Epiphany in January, where supposedly all the important town business was discussed. But that was ceremony. The real decisions happened in smaller meetings, frequent court sessions where the mayor and his inner circle deliberated in private and then announced what they'd decided. The mayor had staff, a chamberlain to handle finances, a common sergeant at law for legal matters, a common clerk to keep records and write official documents, plus an esquire and 2 sergeants who served as bodyguards. Yes, bodyguards. Because being the most powerful man in town meant some people might want to harm you. The mayor's personal security detail was a symbol of his status and a practical necessity. Now all of this might sound official and proper. The mayor holds court, follows procedures, has staff, represents the town. Very legitimate. But here's where it gets interesting. The mayor also had the power to grant trading privileges, to decide who could sell what in which markets, to collect fees and fines that went into the town's coffers, which he had considerable say over how they were spent. He could make or break a merchant's career with a single decision. Approve your request for a market stall, you might prosper. Deny it because you're not in the right guild or didn't show proper respect. You're done. And because he came from the merchant class and would return to being a merchant after his term, his decisions consistently favoured merchants. Guild regulations were enforced harshly against outsiders, but flexibly for guild members. Fines for market violations were collected, rigorously from small traders but somehow forgotten when it was a wealthy merchant's son involved. The darker side of mayoral power, the part that doesn't make it into the official histories, was corruption. Not occasional corruption, not a bad mayor here and there. Systematic, institutional corruption baked into the position. See, mayors weren't paid much in salary. The position was expected to be its own reward and honour for the wealthy. But everyone understood that mayors would supplement their income through gifts. That's what they called them. Gifts. You're a merchant who needs a favourable ruling on a contract dispute. You send the mayor a gift. Some fine wine, maybe, or a piece of cloth, or gold coins presented as a token of respect. Where's the line between a gift and a bribe? Medieval people didn't see much of one. Everyone did it. It was expected. The mayor needed to maintain his lifestyle, his hospitality to other important men, his status. Gifts made that possible. If you didn't send gifts, you were insulting him, suggesting you didn't respect his position. But of course, those who sent the most generous gifts got the most favourable treatment. And those who couldn't afford gifts at all, they got what was left over, which was usually nothing. Mayors also used their position for land accumulation. They'd get information about properties coming available before anyone else. They'd manipulate court cases to force people into debt, then buy their land when they couldn't pay. They'd award themselves town contracts, pay themselves from town funds for services that maybe happened or maybe didn't. There were scandals, of course. In 1376, England saw major corruption accusations during the Good Parliament. William Latimer, the King's Chamberlain, and Richard Lyons, who served as a town official, were accused of massive bribes, embezzlement, using financial loopholes to charge huge interest on loans. They were imprisoned, but within a year they were back in power because they had the right connections and enough money to make problems disappear. That's the pattern. Someone gets caught being too corrupt, too obvious about it. There's an investigation, maybe a trial. They're dismissed from office, possibly fined. Everyone says justice has been served. Then a few years later they're back in government somewhere else, or their family members are, or they're operating through proxies. The system protected its own. Because here's the thing about medieval town government. The mayor wasn't an aberration. The corruption wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. The entire structure was designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a small merchant elite, and everything else flowed from that. As you lie there in your medieval town trying to run a small business or work an honest trade, the mayor loomed over everything. His court could destroy you, his favour could save you, and you had no vote, no voice, no way to influence who he was or what he did. That upright sword he carried, it wasn't just ceremonial, it was a reminder. I have power here. I can judge you, fine you, imprison you, ruin you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sweet dreams. The mayor was the king, but every king needs enforcers. In medieval English towns, those enforcers were the sheriffs, or in earlier periods and smaller towns, the bailiffs. These were the men who made sure the mayor's decisions, and by extension, the entire elite power structure were actually carried out, with force, if necessary. And often, force was necessary. Let's start with what the job actually entailed. In 1396, when York became a county corporate, the town got to appoint 2 sheriffs, instead of the 3 bailiffs it previously had. This wasn't just a name change. sheriffs had more authority, more prestige, more power. They held monthly county courts, just like sheriffs in actual counties did for the king. They had cognizance of petty assizes and all pleas of land, trespass, covenant and contract within the city. That's legal language for they could hear almost any case and pass judgment. The sheriffs were supposed to acquit the city of its farm, which meant they collected all the various revenues the town owed to different authorities. They enforced market regulations, the assizes of bread and ale that set prices and quality standards. They impaneled jurors when trials required them. They were the recipients of mandates from the central government, the men who received royal orders and decided how or whether to implement them. They also had access to considerable income, the huskable, which was a property tax, rents from city-owned property, tolls collected at markets and bridges, stall rents in the marketplaces, issues from fairs and courts, meaning the fees and fines collected from various legal proceedings. All of this flowed through the sheriff's hands. They were supposed to account for it, to hand over what was owed to various parties, but in practice there was considerable room for skimming. In the 15th century the sheriffs were elected by the mayor, aldermen and councillors, who would then present their nominees to the commonalty for endorsement. Notice the pattern. The elite chose, the commons approved. Democracy as theatre. Again. Now, here's where the sheriff's role gets more visceral. Because all those legal powers, all those revenue streams, they meant nothing without the ability to enforce. And enforcement in medieval times meant violence. Controlled, sanctioned, legal violence, but violence nonetheless. The sheriffs had sergeants working under them, enforcers of the enforcers. In London, each sheriff could have up to 4 sergeants, though the number varied based on need. These men carried out arrests. When the mayor or sheriff ordered someone seized, the sergeants went and got them. They didn't knock politely and wait for you to finish your supper. They grabbed you, bound you if you resisted, dragged you to whatever holding cell the town maintained. Court records from 1320 show that sheriffs in one town handled hundreds of cases in just a few months, suggesting something like 4,000 cases a year. That's an enormous caseload. Debt, assault, trespass, and other common disputes flowing through the system constantly. And every one of those cases involved the sheriff's power to compel appearance, to seize property, to enforce judgments. When someone didn't show up for court, the sheriff sent his sergeants to make them show up. When someone was found guilty and fined, the sheriff's men collected the fine, by force if necessary. When someone was sentenced to the stocks or the pillory or whipping, the sheriffs oversaw the punishment. Let's talk about those punishments for a moment, because they reveal the reality of what law enforcement meant in medieval towns. The stocks were wooden frames that locked your ankles in place while you sat on the ground. The pillory was similar but locked your head and hands while you stood. You'd be placed in these devices in the marketplace, the most public place in town, and left there for hours or days. People would throw things at you, rotten vegetables if you were lucky, rocks if they really hated you, spit, insults, sometimes worse. This wasn't just punishment, it was theatre. Public humiliation designed to deter others and to reinforce the hierarchy. You broke the rules, you challenged the system, and look what happened to you. The sheriff made sure you were on display, made sure everyone saw. Whipping was common for more serious offences. You'd be tied to a post or a cart and whipped with a knotted cord or leather strap. The sheriff or his sergeant would do it personally, or oversee someone else doing it. The number of lashes was specified by the court, but the vigour with which they were applied could vary. A sheriff who wanted to send a message might ensure the whipping was particularly brutal, or if you'd paid him a gift beforehand, he might instruct his man to hold back a bit. Because here's where the corruption enters the enforcement side. Sheriffs had enormous discretion. They decided who to arrest for minor offences. They decided how hard to pursue someone accused of a crime. They decided whether to really collect that fine or to forget about it for a while, and people knew this. People understood that sheriffs could be influenced. A sheriff making his rounds through the market could be approached by a merchant who'd violated some regulation. A quiet conversation, maybe a purse changing hands in a handshake, and suddenly that violation wasn't noticed. Someone's goods that should have been seized for not meeting quality standards. The sheriff's eyes just passed right over them. It worked the other way too. If a sheriff or mayor wanted to target someone, they could weaponize enforcement. Suddenly every tiny regulation was applied to that person rigorously. Their market stall was inspected daily. Their goods were seized for imaginary quality problems. They were hauled into court on flimsy accusations, forced to pay legal fees even when found innocent. We have examples from medieval France that parallel what happened in England. In Arras, the baillie, or chief of police, was a man named Jehan de Beaucain. He was spectacularly corrupt, even by medieval standards. An investigation eventually uncovered his involvement in no less than 50 criminal cases where he'd taken bribes, extorted payments, or perverted justice. In one case, a man named Jehan de Fouchy was murdered. Beaucain was called to investigate. He arrested someone named Robert, who confessed under interrogation. Open and shut case, right? Except Robert's friends approached Beaucain with money. Suddenly witnesses appeared saying the murder never happened. Despite a literal corpse, Beaucain declared the case closed. No murder had occurred. Robert walked free. In another case, 2 men had raped a woman outside the city walls in broad daylight with witnesses. Again, you'd think that's pretty clear. But the rapist's friends paid Beaucain a large sum, and he dropped all charges. He had a sliding scale of corruption. More serious crimes cost more to make disappear, but everything had a price. Eventually, the Count of Artois brought charges against Beaucain. He was found guilty, dismissed from his position. Justice served, right? Wrong. Within 3 years, he was back working as baillie of a nearby town. His money and connections had bought him another chance, and he presumably went right back to his corrupt ways. This pattern of officials being caught, briefly punished and returning to power was common throughout medieval Europe. The system couldn't actually purge itself of corruption, because corruption was how it functioned. Officials were underpaid, which meant they had to supplement their income somehow. Those who were good at walking the line between acceptable graft and scandalous theft rose to higher positions. Those who got too greedy, too obvious, were sacrificed to maintain the appearance that justice mattered. For you, living in this medieval town, the sheriff was someone to fear and, if possible, to avoid. You didn't want his attention. If you were wealthy enough, you made sure to send gifts to him just as you did to the mayor, maintaining good relations so that if trouble came, he might overlook it. If you couldn't afford gifts, you kept your head down and prayed. You never ended up in a situation where the sheriff decided you were the problem. The sheriffs weren't just enforcing the law, they were enforcing a social order where wealth meant power and poverty meant vulnerability. Where the rules applied differently depending on who you were and who you knew. Where justice was a commodity that could be bought and sold just like bread or cloth in the marketplace. And everyone knew it. It wasn't a secret. It was simply how things worked. The sheriff had power, and power in medieval England meant the ability to use violence on behalf of those who paid you, and to use it against those who didn't. That's what law enforcement looked like when there was no professional police force, no internal affairs, no oversight beyond other corrupt officials. The sheriff's authority came from the same small group of wealthy men who ran everything else in town. He was their enforcer, their strong arm, the reminder that challenge to the system would be met with physical consequences. So as you drift off tonight, imagine being grabbed by the sheriff's sergeants for some minor offence, dragged through the streets while your neighbours watched, thrown in a damp cell without trial for as long as the sheriff felt like keeping you there. Imagine knowing that your fate depended entirely on whether you had enough money to make your problem disappear, or whether you'd end up as an example for everyone else. That's the reality of law enforcement in medieval England. That's who really kept the peace in your town. Now we need to talk about the real power behind the throne, so to speak. The mayors and sheriffs, as powerful as they were, they came from somewhere. They didn't materialise out of thin air with authority and wealth. They rose through a system, and that system was the guilds. Medieval guilds were not, as you might imagine, friendly social clubs for craftsmen to share tips and have a beer after work. They were economic cartels, monopolistic organisations that controlled every aspect of trade and production in their particular industry. They decided who could work, who could sell, what prices could be charged, what quality standards had to be met. They were in effect private governments running parallel to the town government, and often more powerful than it. There were 2 main types of guilds, and understanding the difference matters. Merchant guilds came first, associations of traders who bought and sold goods. These were the wholesalers, the import-export men, the people who moved large quantities of valuable merchandise. Craft guilds came later, associations of artisans who actually made things. Weavers, fullers, carpenters, bakers, butchers, every skilled trade you can imagine. By the late medieval period, Guild proliferation had reached remarkable levels. Britain had over 100 guilds. Paris alone had 120. Florence had 21 major guilds controlling some 30,000 workers. These weren't small operations. They were the economic infrastructure of medieval urban life. And here's the key thing to understand. You could not work in a town without guild membership. Not legally, anyway. If you wanted to bake bread for sale, you joined the Baker's Guild or you didn't bake. Want to weave cloth? Join the Weaver's Guild or find another town. The guilds had monopolies, granted by town charters or royal privilege, that made non-guild work illegal. Try to operate outside the guild system in the town. Government, which was run by guild members, remember, would fine you, seize your goods, potentially imprison you. The guild system had developed over centuries with a seemingly reasonable justification. By having everyone in a trade be part of an organisation, you could maintain quality standards. You could train new workers properly through apprenticeship. You could ensure fair prices so no one undercut others too severely. You could provide mutual aid when members fell on hard times, supporting widows and orphans, caring for the sick and elderly. But in practice, the guild system became a mechanism for enrichment and control by those who held power within the guilds. Let's talk about how someone actually became a guild member, because this is where the trap becomes visible. You couldn't just show up and ask to join. First, you needed to be accepted as an apprentice by a current master in the guild. Apprenticeship typically lasted 2 to 7 years, during which time you worked for that master, learning the trade. The master provided housing and food, nominally, though the quality varied wildly. You provided free labour. To become an apprentice, you usually had to pay a fee. Right from the start, guild membership required money. If your family was poor, you couldn't afford the fee, which meant you couldn't become an apprentice, which meant you'd never learn the trade properly, which meant you'd never be a guild member. The system was designed to keep out the poor from the beginning. After your apprenticeship, if you survived it, and your master didn't decide to extend it arbitrarily, you became a journeyman. The word comes from the French journée, meaning day. You were paid by the day for your work. You were certified. You could work. But you couldn't own your own shop or take on apprentices. You worked for masters, and you paid the guild dues that entitled you to keep working. To become a master, the highest rank, you had to create a masterpiece, a piece of work showcasing your highest skill, and submit it to the guild for approval. The existing masters would examine it and vote on whether it met their standards. If they approved, you could become a master, open your own shop, take apprentices, participate in guild governance. Here's the thing about that masterpiece approval. It was entirely subjective. The existing masters decided, and they had strong incentives to reject people. Every new master was a new competitor. More masters meant more shops, more products on the market, more competition for customers. The guilds explicitly wanted to limit competition. So unless you had connections, unless your family was already in the guild, unless you'd made the right friends and paid the right informal fees, your masterpiece might be rejected for vague reasons about quality or technique. Sons of existing masters had a much easier path. They often got apprenticeships for free or reduced fees. Their masterpieces were judged much more leniently. Nepotism wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The guilds actively tried to keep power and wealth within the same families generation after generation. All of this created a rigid economic hierarchy. At the top were the guild masters, who owned shops, employed others, accumulated wealth. In the middle were journeymen, who could work but never get ahead. At the bottom were apprentices, essentially unfree labour. And completely outside the system were the majority of townspeople who couldn't afford entry at all, who survived on casual labour and the hope that they wouldn't starve. But the guild's power extended far beyond just controlling who worked in what trade. They controlled the entire economy of the town through their political influence. Remember how we talked about mayors and aldermen? They were guild masters. The political class and the guild master class were the same people. In London, the wealthiest craft guilds became known as livery companies, and they didn't just dominate city politics, they were city politics. You couldn't build a political career without guild membership. Becoming an alderman required being a successful guild master first. The mayor was elected from the guild elite. This meant that town laws were written by guild masters to benefit guilds. Market regulations were enforced by sheriffs who were guild members against non-guild traders. Court cases between guild members and outsiders were heard by judges who were guild masters. Every lever of power in the town served guild interests. Guilds also had their own internal courts and enforcement mechanisms. If a member violated guild rules, broke agreements with other members, or damaged the guild's reputation, they could be fined, suspended, or expelled. An expulsion from your guild meant you couldn't work in your trade anymore. In a specialised medieval economy, that could mean destitution. The guild's internal discipline was more powerful than the town's legal system in many ways, because it could destroy your livelihood without having to prove anything in court. The guilds controlled prices through coordination. They'd meet, decide what price bread should sell for, and all members would charge that price. Was this price gouging? Depends who you ask. The guilds would say they were ensuring fair prices and preventing ruinous competition. Everyone else would point out that coordinated price setting meant they could charge whatever they wanted, and customers had no alternatives. They controlled working hours. You weren't allowed to work before sunrise or after sunset in some guilds, ostensibly because quality would suffer in poor light, but it also limited production, which kept prices high. They controlled how many apprentices a master could have, limiting the future supply of trained workers. They set quality standards that just happened to be expensive to meet, pricing out potential competitors. When guilds got too powerful, too monopolistic, even medieval people noticed and complained. Governments would sometimes step in, though success varied. In England, where royal government was relatively strong, the more important guilds faced some oversight. Regulations had to be approved by royal officials. Disputes could be appealed to king's courts. But enforcement was sporadic, and guilds were very good at working around rules. In self-governing cities where guilds had more freedom, abuse was rampant. They'd let quality slip once their monopoly was secure, knowing customers had no choice. They'd raise prices arbitrarily. They'd exclude anyone they didn't like for any reason or no reason. There were rebellions against guild power, which we'll get to later, but for now, just understand. Craft guilds eventually fought back against merchant guilds for control. This wasn't a fight between the powerful and the powerless. It was two powerful groups fighting over how to divide the spoils of controlling everyone else. In places like Lynn, merchant fraternities like the Holy Trinity Guild owned major infrastructure. They owned the common quay where ships loaded and unloaded. They owned the crane that lifted cargo. They even owned the hall where town government met, and they lent money to the town government, which meant the government was literally in debt to a private merchant organisation. You can imagine how that influenced policy. The guilds were in many ways more powerful than the ostensible town government, because they controlled the economy. The mayor might have legal authority, but if the guilds decided to stop operating, to shut down their shops and refuse to trade, the town's economy would collapse within days. This gave them enormous leverage in any dispute. Living in a medieval town meant living under guild control even if you weren't a member. They determined what goods were available and at what prices. They determined what jobs existed and who could work them. They enforced standards of behaviour even on non-members through their influence over town government. The guilds were a pervasive, inescapable force shaping every aspect of economic life. And for those outside the system, for the poor who could never afford guild membership, for women who were mostly excluded from guilds, for anyone deemed undesirable for whatever reason, the guilds were a wall, a barrier between them and economic advancement that could never be climbed because the people on top kept making it higher. So when you wonder who really ran your medieval town, the answer is increasingly clear. Not the distant king, not even the mayor really. The guilds, and specifically the masters of the merchant guilds who controlled trade and accumulated the most wealth, they were the true power. They wrote the rules, enforced the rules, judged disputes about the rules, and profited at every step. And they made absolutely certain that no one could challenge their position without being crushed. Behind every mayor, advising every decision, sitting in judgment on every important case were the aldermen. If the mayor was the visible face of power in your medieval town, the aldermen were the collective mind that actually ran things. They were the inner circle, the real rulers, the men who remained powerful regardless of which mayor was currently in office. Let's understand the structure first. Most towns had some version of concentric circles of council around the mayor. The innermost ring was usually called the Council of 12, though the number varied by town. By around 1399, these men were being called aldermen to distinguish them from other councillors. Then there might be an outer ring of 24 probi homines, good men, another level of advisors. Beyond that, the communitas, the 48 or so men representing the commons in major assemblies. But make no mistake, real power resided in that innermost circle. the alderman. Election to alderman wasn't really an election in any modern sense. When a vacancy occurred due to death, old age, or ill health, the mayor and remaining aldermen would choose someone to fill it. They picked from among themselves, from the wealthiest merchant families, from men who'd already proven their loyalty to the system by serving in other capacities. Usually you needed to have been sheriff first. That was the qualification. Had you held power successfully? Had you enriched yourself while maintaining the appearance of propriety? Had you shown you'd protect the interests of the merchant elite? Congratulations, you're an alderman now. Once chosen, you couldn't refuse. William Todd tried to decline in York in 1481, saying he didn't want the position. He was fined £10, an enormous sum, for his reluctance. The message was clear. Being an alderman wasn't an honour you could turn down. It was a duty you owed to your class, a position you'd occupy whether you wanted to or not, because the system needed men in those seats to function. Some occupations were considered incompatible with being an alderman. When John Petty was elected in York in 1504, he was told to stop keeping his hostelry, his inn, and take down his sign. Why? Because an alderman needed to be above the day-to-day commerce of running a public house. He needed to appear respectable, dignified, a cut above ordinary businessmen, even though he absolutely was a businessman and would use his alderman position to advance his business interests. The aldermen met regularly with the mayor to discuss and decide all-important town business. They sat beside him in court, acting as advisors and judges. When the mayor had to make a decision about enforcing some law, granting some privilege, settling some dispute, he consulted the aldermen. Their collective judgment carried enormous weight. A mayor might technically have authority to overrule them, but in practice going against the unanimous opinion of the aldermen was politically dangerous. They'd still be there after his term ended. They might be the ones deciding whether he got elected again or whether his business ventures prospered. The aldermen also held their own courts called ward motes. Each alderman presided over a ward, a district of the city. The ward mote was a local meeting where supposedly anyone in the ward could bring up issues. In London, by 1376, there were 24 wards, each with its alderman. Ward motes discussed things like tavern hours, fence lines between properties, suspected criminals in the neighbourhood. These meetings created an appearance of local democracy, of communities governing themselves. But control was maintained through the alderman's management of these meetings. He decided which issues were serious enough to bring to the mayor's court. He decided which complaints were valid and which were dismissed. He decided whether someone accused of something would face real consequences or just a stern warning. The alderman was judge, jury, and administrator for his ward, and his power was checked only by the other aldermen, who all had the same interests he did. According to historian Barbara Hannawalt, the mayor and aldermen of medieval towns were busy listening to citizens' complaints from morning to night. Medieval townspeople were extraordinarily litigious, constantly bringing cases to court, filing complaints, demanding justice for every petty grievance. This created an enormous workload for the aldermen, but it also reinforced their power. Every dispute that was brought to them for resolution was another reminder that they held authority. They decided. You complained, and they judged whether your complaint mattered. The aldermen also controlled lawmaking, when the town needed new regulations, when trade practices needed updating, when market rules required revision. The aldermen drafted and approved these laws. Sometimes there'd be a show of presenting them to a larger assembly for approval, but the aldermen had already decided what the laws would say, and why. The broader assembly just rubber-stamped their decisions. This meant the law itself served aldermanic interests. A law limiting when apprentices could become masters. That came from aldermen who didn't want more competition. A regulation specifying exact quality standards for goods that just happened to be expensive to meet. Aldermen protecting their market share. Price controls that benefited established merchants over new traders. Aldermen again. Let's talk about what it was like to live under this system, as someone who wasn't an alderman. You're a craftsman, let's say. You're a member of your craft guild. You've worked hard. Maybe you've even become a master in your trade. You own a small shop. You have an apprentice or two. You're doing okay, making a modest living. But you have no political voice. You can't become an alderman unless you're far wealthier than you'll ever be. You can attend ward motes, and you might even speak if you're brave, but the alderman running it will decide whether your words matter. You can bring cases to court, but the judges are aldermen or men appointed by aldermen. If your interests conflict with an alderman's interests, you'll lose. You can't appeal to anyone beyond the system because the system is all there is, and you watch as the aldermen grow wealthier while you struggle. They use their positions to get first knowledge of lucrative opportunities. They award town contracts to themselves or their family members. They manipulate court cases to acquire properties at below-market prices. They operate in a web of mutual favours and protections, helping each other, while everyone else competes in an economy they've carefully rigged. The most insidious aspect of aldermanic power was its permanence. Mayors came and went, usually serving one-year terms, though sometimes longer. Sheriffs were replaced regularly, but aldermen served for life, or until they were too old and infirm to continue. This meant institutional memory, long-term planning, and relationships that spanned decades all resided with the aldermen. They were the continuity of the power structure, the permanent government behind the rotating faces of elected officials. If you angered an alderman, he would remember. Years later, when you needed some favour from town government, he'd still be there, still influential, still able to ensure your request was denied. The alderman played a long game that ordinary people couldn't match, because ordinary people's lives were precarious enough that they couldn't afford to think beyond next month's rent and food. There were attempts at reform, efforts to break the aldermanic stranglehold on power. We'll discuss those later. But what's important to understand now is that the aldermen were selected, not elected. They were self-perpetuating oligarchy that controlled who joined their ranks and maintained their collective power through cooperation with each other. They might have personal rivalries, different economic interests, disputes about specific policies, but they all agreed on the fundamental point: power should remain with them and people like them. Wealthy merchants, established families, men who'd proven they'd protect the system that enriched them. As you lie there in your medieval town, working your trade, raising your family, trying to get by, the aldermen are the shadow council you never elected, can never remove, and must constantly work to please. They are the permanent government, the real power, the men who'll decide whether your life improves or worsens without ever asking what you think, and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's get down to street level now. Talk about the men who enforce the system at its most basic, local level. The constables, not the police officers with uniforms and training that the word might evoke for you. Medieval constables were something else entirely. They were neighbours pressed into service, given a bit of authority, and told to keep order in their parish or ward. And sometimes that authority went to their heads in interesting ways. Every parish had constables, usually 2 or 3 per parish depending on its size. These weren't professional law enforcement. They were local men, chosen annually, presented to the alderman and then to the mayor for approval. It was a duty, like jury service would be later. You got chosen, you served your term, you tried not to get killed or make too many enemies while doing it. The constable's oath required them to keep the peace, arrest troublemakers, deliver them to the sheriffs for justice. If someone resisted arrest, constables were authorised to raise the hue and cry, an old Anglo-Saxon tradition where everyone nearby was legally obligated to help pursue a criminal. You'd hear shouting, a chase would begin, and everyone was supposed to join in or face punishment themselves for failing to assist. They also searched for outsiders or suspicious individuals. Medieval towns were deeply suspicious of strangers. If you didn't belong, if you couldn't prove you had legitimate business, the constables might arrest you just for being there. Vagrancy was essentially criminalised. If you looked poor and weren't from the parish, you were probably a criminal or a beggar, and either way you needed to move along. Constables reported everything to the sheriffs: who was causing trouble, who'd been in a fight, who was suspected of theft, who wasn't paying their taxes. They were the eyes and ears of the power structure, informants in every neighbourhood watching their own neighbours and reporting anything unusual. They also had mundane responsibilities: keeping pavements repaired in their parish, making sure dung, mire and other filth was cleared from the streets. When the air smelled bad, which it frequently did in medieval towns, the constables were supposed to find and remove the source. They coordinated when troops needed to be raised for the king's armies, going door to conscript men and collect money for their wages. Imagine being chosen as constable. You're a craftsman, maybe, or a small merchant. You have your own work to do, but now you're also responsible for policing your neighbourhood. Your neighbours, people you know personally, are supposed to obey you when you act in your official capacity. That creates complicated dynamics. You might be tempted to overlook violations by friends while strictly enforcing rules against people you don't like. or you might be too harsh trying to prove your impartiality, or you might just be corrupt, taking small bribes to ignore minor crimes. There was no training, no oversight beyond the sheriffs who had their own corrupt practices to worry about. Constables learned by doing, made it up as they went, and navigated the tension between being a neighbour and being an authority figure. The ward system above the parish level added another layer. In large cities, wards were administrative districts, each with an alderman. The alderman held ward motes, meetings where ward business was discussed. Constables attended these, reported on their activities, received instructions. The ward mote was theoretically open to all residents of the ward, a place where anyone could bring up concerns or complaints. In practice, ward motes reinforced hierarchy while creating an appearance of participation. The alderman presided, controlled the agenda, decided what was important. Common residents could speak, but the alderman decided whether to act on what they said. Serious matters might be elevated to the mayor's court. Most complaints were handled locally, if at all. Ward motes also served as intelligence gathering. By hearing what people were concerned about, what disputes were brewing, what resentments were building, the alderman could identify potential problems before they became rebellions. They could intervene early, address the most serious complaints while ignoring the rest, and maintain control through the appearance of responsive governance. For you, living in this system, constables were ambiguous figures. They might protect you if someone tried to rob you or assault you. The hue and cry meant community response to crime. But they were also agents of control who might arrest you for violating some regulation you didn't know existed, who watched your behaviour and reported anything suspicious to higher authorities, who were just as likely to be corrupt as helpful, and you couldn't refuse them. When a constable ordered you to do something in his official capacity, you had to comply. Refusal meant arrest, fines, potential violence. Even if the constable was wrong, even if he was abusing his authority, your option was to comply and then complain to the sheriff or alderman later. Good luck with that if the constable had connections. The genius of using constables was that it distributed enforcement throughout the population. Instead of needing a large force of professional enforcers, which would be expensive, the system made neighbours police each other. It created a surveillance state where everyone watched everyone, where stepping out of line was noticed and reported, where community bonds were weaponized for control. Some historians argue that this system actually gave common people some power, because they could use hue and cry and other mechanisms to criticize leaders. Christopher Fletcher has written about how disenfranchised urban populations mobilized communal policing against civic leaders they opposed. True enough, but that power was limited, easily suppressed, and often turned back against those who tried to wield it. The ward system in particular created a brilliant illusion. Look, you have local meetings, you can raise concerns, you have a voice in governance. But structurally the alderman controlled the ward absolutely. The constables reported to him. The ward mote operated under his rules. Any real power flowed downward from the alderman to the constables to the people, never upward, as you drift deeper into sleep tonight. Imagine living in a place where your neighbour might be a constable next year, where he'd have authority to arrest you, where he'd be watching to see if you violated any of the hundreds of regulations governing every aspect of life. Imagine knowing that complaint about him would go to an alderman who probably appointed him in the first place. That's street-level control in medieval England. That's how the system reached into every neighbourhood, every parish, every street. Not through professional police, but through ordinary people given a taste of power and the authority to enforce the rules that kept everyone else in line. We've talked about political power, legal power, enforcement power. Now we need to talk about economic power, because in medieval towns, economic power often mattered more than any legal authority. And the men who wielded that power, the great merchants, they were as close to princes as anyone not born to nobility could be. These weren't shopkeepers. The great merchants of medieval England were operating on an entirely different scale. They were international traders moving goods across Europe and beyond. They were bankers lending enormous sums to kings and nobles. They were landowners with estates rivaling minor nobility. They were shipping magnates with their own fleets. They were the men who made markets exist, who connected producers with consumers across vast distances, who facilitated the trade that made urban life possible, and they used that position to extract wealth at every step. Let's start with the most basic level: control of trade routes. In a medieval town, goods came in and out through specific channels: roads, rivers, ports. The great merchants controlled access to these channels, either literally through ownership or effectively through their networks and relationships. If you were a smaller trader trying to bring goods to market, you went through them. They set the terms, took their cut, and there was no alternative. Merchant guilds formalised this control. Remember, only guild members could engage in wholesale trade in a town. The merchant guild had a monopoly, granted by charter, that made non-member trading illegal. This meant the merchant guildmasters could set prices for goods coming into town, determine what goods were available, and eliminate anyone who tried to compete with them. They also controlled the terms of transactions. Medieval trade operated largely on credit. Coins were scarce. Moving physical gold or silver was dangerous. So much of commerce involved promises to pay later. The great merchants extended credit, but at rates we'd consider usurious. 20, 30, even 50% interest on loans wasn't unusual. They'd lend money for trade ventures, for purchasing goods, for paying debts. When someone couldn't repay, the merchant could seize their property, take their goods, or demand service. One particularly clever mechanism was withernam, a practice in medieval England where if a merchant from one town was wronged in another place, all merchants from that town could have their goods seized to make up the debt. This sounds chaotic, but merchant guilds used it as a weapon. If a king or lord seized goods from guild members, the guild threatened to boycott that entire realm. No trade, no goods flowing through, no tariff revenue. For kingdoms dependent on commerce, this was devastating. So merchant guilds could effectively negotiate with kings as equals because they controlled the economic lifeline. The great merchants also operated as bankers to nobility and royalty. Kings needed money constantly for wars, for administration, for maintaining their courts. They'd borrow from merchant syndicates, promising repayment from future taxes or granting trading privileges as collateral. When kings couldn't repay, they'd grant more privileges, more monopolies, more legal protections to merchants. Edward III borrowed so heavily from Italian merchant banks that when those banks failed, partly due to his unpaid debts, it triggered an economic crisis across Europe. English merchants learned from this. They'd lend to kings but demand immediate tangible concessions, charters for their towns, monopolies on certain goods, exemptions from taxes, rights to run their own courts. The crown was perpetually in debt to merchant wealth, which gave merchants enormous influence over royal policy. At the local level, this manifested in total economic dominance. The merchant guild in a town decided who could sell what goods. Foreign merchants, traders from other towns, had to pay massive fees to do business. They might have to use local merchants as intermediaries, adding a mandatory middleman fee to every transaction. They might be restricted to certain times and places for selling. The local merchant guild wanted to extract maximum value from any outside competition. Local non-guild members simply couldn't operate. Try to open a shop without guild membership, and the sheriffs, who remember were also guild members, would shut you down, fine you, seize your goods. The market stalls were rented only to guild members, the warehouses were owned by guild members, the transport was controlled by guild members. Every choke point in the economic system was owned or controlled by the same small group of merchant families. And because the merchant elite were also the political elite, they could use town government to enforce their economic monopoly with the full weight of law. Courts ruled in favour of guild members against outsiders. Regulations were written to benefit established merchants. Town funds were spent on infrastructure that served merchant interests, like improving roads to warehouses or building market halls that charged rent to traders. The merchants also practiced what we might call vertical integration. They didn't just buy and sell goods, they controlled production. A wool merchant might own the sheep farms producing the wool. He'd own or control the workshops where it was woven into cloth. He'd own the ships transporting it. He'd have exclusive contracts with buyers in foreign markets. Every step of the process he took a cut, and no one else could compete because he controlled the entire chain. Land ownership was another avenue of power. Successful merchants bought estates outside towns, becoming landowners. This gave them agricultural income independent of trade. It gave them social prestige, moving them closer to the nobility. It gave them political influence in the countryside as well as the town. Some merchant families, over generations, would eventually gain nobility themselves, using their wealth to buy titles and marry into aristocratic families. But even as merchants, their wealth was staggering. Inventories from wealthy merchants show they owned multiple properties. extensive collections of luxury goods, large sums of cash and credit instruments. They dressed in fine cloth, ate expensive food, threw lavish banquets to display their status. Their homes were the finest in town, multi-story stone buildings when everyone else lived in wooden shacks. They could afford to send sons to university or into the church, diversifying family power across institutions. This wealth wasn't just for show. It brought protection, influence, and power. A wealthy merchant could maintain a private staff, including armed men for security. He could afford the best lawyers for any legal dispute. He could lend money to officials who then owed him favours. He could support political allies and destroy enemies through economic pressure. Consider the situation if you crossed a merchant prince. Maybe you're a craftsman who refused to sell your goods through his network, trying to find buyers directly. He can use his influence with the guild to have you investigated for quality violations. He can have his allies on the town council pass a regulation that makes your business model illegal. He can call in debts he or his associates are owed by people you depend on, causing a cascade of economic problems. He can spread rumours damaging your reputation. And if all else fails, he can use his connections to sheriffs to have you arrested on some pretext. You have no equivalent leverage. You're not wealthy enough to fight him legally. You don't have political connections to protect you. Your livelihood depends on systems he and men like him control. The economic stranglehold is complete. There's a reason these men were called merchant princes. They lived like nobility, ruled like nobility, and often were treated like nobility even without formal titles. Their economic power translated into every other kind of power, because money, then as now, could buy almost anything. The system they created wasn't capitalism in the modern sense. It wasn't free markets. It was monopolistic corporatism where a small elite controlled the economy through guilds and used political power to maintain those monopolies. Competition was minimised, prices were fixed, new entrants were blocked. The goal wasn't efficient markets, but maximum extraction of wealth by those in control. And this system persisted for centuries because it was self-reinforcing. Merchant wealth brought political power protected merchant monopolies, monopolies generated more wealth. Breaking this cycle required external shocks, massive social upheavals that we'll discuss later. But for most of the medieval period, if you wanted to understand who ran your town, follow the money. It led straight to the merchant princes who owned everything and everyone. We need to talk about the other major institution operating in medieval towns, the church. Because while we've focused on merchants, guilds, mayors and aldermen, there was another power structure running parallel to all of this, sometimes supporting it, sometimes competing with it, but always influential. The church wasn't just where you prayed on Sundays. It was a landlord, a legal authority, a political player, and a mechanism of social control. In some towns, bishops or abbots were literally the lords of the town. Lynn, for example, had the Bishop of Norwich as its overlord. The bishop operated the most important law courts in town. When Lynn's mayor took office, he had to swear loyalty to the bishop, not to the king or to the town's people. The bishop could override local decisions, intervene in disputes, and demand payments and services from the town. This arrangement was more common than you might think. Many medieval towns had developed around monasteries or cathedral cities. The religious institution was there first. The town grew up around it to serve pilgrims or monastery needs. The church never forgot it was there first, and maintained claims to authority that secular town governments had to navigate carefully. Even in towns without bishops as overlords, the church owned enormous amounts of real estate. Churches, obviously, but also houses, shops, warehouses, fields outside town walls. These properties generated rental income that made the local church administration very wealthy. And because church property was technically exempt from many taxes and regulations, it created a parallel economy operating under different rules. Church courts were another layer of authority. These courts had jurisdiction over moral and spiritual matters, but the definition of what counted as moral or spiritual was quite broad. Marriage disputes, anything involving oaths or promises, accusations of heresy, sexual misconduct, and various other sins fell under church courts. But church courts also heard disputes involving clerics, which meant if a priest was accused of a crime, the secular courts often couldn't touch him. He'd be tried in church court, where punishments were generally lighter, and protecting the institution's reputation was a priority. The relationship between secular town government and church authority was complex and often contentious. Town officials wanted autonomy. the ability to govern without interference. Church officials wanted to maintain their traditional privileges and powers. The result was constant negotiation, occasional conflict, and a patchwork of compromises that varied by location and over time. Religious guilds added another dimension. Many guilds combined economic functions with religious ones. They'd have a patron saint, celebrate religious festivals together, pay for masses for deceased members, maintain altars in churches. The Holy Trinity Guild in Lynn, which we mentioned earlier, was technically a religious fraternity. It happened to control major town infrastructure and lend money to the government, but it framed itself as a pious organisation dedicated to holy purposes. This blending of religious and economic power was typical. Wealthy merchants would donate lavishly to churches, funding construction, paying for elaborate services, endowing chantries where priests would say masses for their souls after death. This wasn't just piety, it was social capital. Being known as a generous supporter of the church enhanced your reputation, demonstrated your wealth, and created relationships with church officials who might support you in disputes or provide useful information. The church also controlled charity. In theory, the church cared for the poor, the sick, the widows and orphans. In practice, this function reinforced social hierarchies. The wealthy donated to charity, demonstrating their virtue and generosity. The poor received charity, making them dependent and grateful. The church administered charity, giving it power over who received help and who didn't. But let's talk about church corruption, because medieval churches were often as corrupt as secular institutions. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was technically illegal under canon law but widely practiced. A wealthy merchant family might pay to have their son appointed as a priest or a church official. That position came with income from church lands, influence over parish affairs, and a role in the social hierarchy. The church condemned simony while looking the other way when it happened because church institutions needed money too. Selling indulgences was another practice that generated massive revenue and resentment. The doctrine held that sins could be forgiven and punishment in purgatory reduced through acts of penance or purchasing indulgences. The church sold these indulgences, essentially certificates of reduced punishment, to raise funds for various projects. The wealthy could literally buy their way out of spiritual consequences while the poor suffered. This practice was so corrupt it eventually helped trigger the Protestant Reformation. At the local level, parish priests often lived better than their parishioners while preaching humility and poverty. They collected tithes, a 10% tax on income that everyone was required to pay. They charged fees for baptisms, marriages, funerals. They had to be paid for saying masses, hearing confessions, blessing homes. The sacraments, theoretically free gifts of God's grace, came with a price list. Some clergy were genuinely pious and served their communities well, but many were just men working a job, some using their position to enrich themselves, others doing the minimum required to keep their appointment. And because attacking the church meant risking accusations of heresy, a crime punishable by death, criticism was dangerous. The church also functioned as an intelligence network. Confession meant people told priests their secrets, their sins, their plans. A priest who heard someone confessing to a serious crime had a spiritual duty not to reveal it, but he might subtly influence that person towards some action that served the church's interests. He might share information with church superiors, who shared it with secular authorities if it suited them. The confessional booth was a panopticon of the soul. Excommunication was the church's ultimate weapon against individuals. Being excommunicated meant you were cut off from the sacraments, from Christian community, theoretically from salvation itself. In a deeply religious society, this was terrifying. It also had practical consequences. Excommunicated people could be shunned, refused service, denied business relationships. For a merchant, excommunication could mean economic ruin because no one would trade with you. The church used this power to enforce compliance, refuse to pay church taxes, risk excommunication, challenge a church court's decision, excommunication, speak against church teachings, definitely excommunication. It was a tool of control as powerful as any secular punishment, maybe more so because it threatened eternal consequences. The bishops who controlled some towns used all these mechanisms to maintain authority. They could threaten excommunication, use church courts to punish enemies, leverage their control of church lands and wealth to influence local politics. When bishops and town governments cooperated, as they often did when both wanted to maintain the social order. The result was a nearly unbreakable power structure. In Walsall, for example, the mayor and wardens petitioned the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield to approve ordinances the town's craft guilds had agreed on. They appealed to him as their spiritual lord, asking him to confirm rules made for the praise and honour of the Holy Trinity and the profit of the Church. In June 1502, the bishop issued letters declaring these ordinances official. Secular and religious authority merged, sanctifying the town's power structure with divine approval. This is the hidden hand of the Church in medieval urban life. Not just a place of worship, but an institution with legal authority, economic power, political influence, and the ability to shape behaviour through both spiritual and material means. The merchants and guilds ran the economy and politics, but the Church provided the ideological framework justifying it all. It taught that hierarchy was divinely ordained, that the wealthy were blessed by God, that the poor should accept their station, that obedience to authority was a Christian virtue. Some clergy pushed back against this. There were reformers, critics of corruption, priests who genuinely tried to serve the poor, but institutional incentives favoured cooperation with secular elites. The Church was deeply embedded in the medieval economy and power structure, dependent on the same system for its wealth and influence. So when you think about who controlled your medieval town, add the Church to the list. Not separate from the merchant oligarchy, but intertwined with it, supporting it, benefiting from it, and occasionally competing with it for supremacy. The altar and the marketplace, both serving the same masters. Now let's talk about one of the most brilliant illusions of medieval urban governance, the common assembly. Because despite everything we've discussed about oligarchic control, about merchants and guild masters and aldermen running everything, medieval towns often had assemblies where supposedly the entire community gathered to make decisions. Democracy in action, right? Not quite. More like democracy as performance, a carefully staged production designed to create the appearance of popular consent while ensuring real power remained exactly where it always was. Let's understand how these assemblies worked. Most towns had some form of large gathering where citizens, or at least citizens who met certain property requirements, would convene to vote on major decisions, electing the mayor, approving new regulations, major expenditures, whether to support the king in a war. These weren't small meetings. In London, hundreds of people might attend. The assemblies typically met in large halls. Guild halls were purpose-built for this, with massive open spaces on the ground floor where crowds could gather. The architecture itself was revealing. Ground floor for the commons, upper floors for the elite. The common assembly would meet below while the real decision-makers met in private chambers above. When you attended one of these assemblies, you'd see all the trappings of democratic process. Officials would read out proposals. Discussion might be allowed, within limits. Then a vote would be taken. Often this was a show of hands, making it very public who supported what position. Sometimes there were more complex voting procedures, but public voting was common, and it had a chilling effect on dissent, because everyone could see if you voted against the mayor's proposal. The procedures followed certain customs that gave the appearance of legitimacy. The assembly had to be formally summoned with proper notice. The right officials had to be present. Certain ritual phrases had to be spoken. It looked official, procedurally sound, democratic. But here's what was happening behind the scenes. The proposals being voted on had already been decided by the mayor and aldermen in their private meetings upstairs, or in previous closed-door sessions. The assembly wasn't deliberating, it was ratifying. The actual debate, the real decision-making, had happened elsewhere, among a small group who'd already determined the outcome. If discussion was allowed in the assembly, there were ways to manage it. The mayor presided and decided who could speak and for how long. Supporters of the mayor's position could be planted to speak in favour. Opposition voices could be cut off, ruled out of order, or shouted down by organised supporters. The appearance of open debate was maintained while ensuring the predetermined outcome. The vote itself could be managed in various ways. Voice votes, where people shouted aye or nay, could be interpreted by the presiding officer however he wanted. Show of hands in a crowded room made it easy to claim the majority favoured whatever the mayor wanted. And remember, voting was public, which meant everyone knew if you dissented. For someone dependent on the mayor's favour for their livelihood, voting against his proposal was dangerous. Sometimes the assembly would appear to reject something, and the mayor would have to adjust. This was actually part of the performance. Allowing occasional defeats on minor issues made the whole process seem more legitimate. The assembly had real power, see, they just voted down the mayor's proposal, but look closer at what was defeated. Usually something the elite didn't care much about anyway, a symbolic concession that cost them nothing. Lynn provides a fascinating case study, because unusually detailed records survive from disputes there between 1411 and 1420. 3 groups were fighting for power: the potentiores, the wealthiest, most powerful men, the mediocres, a middle group of substantial but not elite merchants and craftsmen, and the inferiores, the poorer common people. The question at the heart of the dispute was about the nature of popular control. Should the commons as a whole have the right to witness governance, to observe the elite making decisions so they could hold them accountable? Or should governance be delegated to representatives who would deliberate in private and then report their decisions? This might sound abstract, but it was fundamental. Ocular democracy, governance by watching, meant the commons could see whether officials were following proper procedures, whether they were embezzling funds, whether they were making backroom deals. It was limited power, just watching, but it was something. Vocal democracy, governance by representation, meant the commons elected people to councils who then made decisions in private. The commons had a voice through their representatives, but they couldn't see what those representatives actually did. After riots and prolonged struggle, Lynn reached a compromise. A new Common Council of 27 was created that participated in deliberative government. More people were brought into the decision-making process, expanding the group of insiders. But opportunities for the commonalty as a whole to witness governance decreased. Meetings moved to private chambers more often. The commons were told their representatives were handling things. Trust them, no need to watch. The wealthy won. They had expanded the power-sharing circle slightly, co-opting some of the middle group who'd been agitating for change, but they'd reduced public accountability. The common assemblies continued, but they were increasingly ceremonial, rubber-stamping decisions made elsewhere. This pattern repeated across medieval England. Assemblies existed. They went through democratic procedures, but real power operated outside and above them. The assembly was theatre, a production stage to create legitimacy and consent. Why bother with the performance if they had all the power anyway? Because legitimacy mattered. Even oligarchies need the consent of the governed, or at least the appearance of it. If common people believed they had no say whatsoever, rebellion became more likely. But if they believed they participated in governance through assemblies, even as those assemblies were managed and controlled, they were more likely to accept outcomes. The performance also served another function, testing the elite's ability to govern. When officials had to present their decisions to an assembly, they had to perform their roles convincingly. A mayor who couldn't command an assembly, who couldn't get them to approve his proposals, was revealing weakness. Other elites would notice. His political support might erode. So the assemblies became stages where officials demonstrated their mastery of political theatre, proving they could manage the commons effectively. Living through this as a common person created a peculiar psychological experience. You attended assemblies, you voted, you felt like you participated. But over time, you noticed your votes never actually changed anything important. The proposals passed regardless. The same families held power. The system continued unchanged. You'd start to feel powerless despite going through democratic motions. Some people called this out. There were complaints, accusations that assemblies were shams. But those complaints were rarely acted upon because the people hearing them were the same people benefiting from the system. You could complain to the mayor that the mayor was rigging assemblies, but why would he do anything about it? The brilliance of the common assembly system was that it provided a release valve for discontent while preventing actual change. People could voice frustrations in a controlled setting. They could vote against unpopular measures knowing their votes would be outnumbered or ignored. They could feel they'd done something without threatening the power structure. And when they finally got frustrated enough to riot, to really threaten the system, the elites could point to the assemblies and say, "But you have a voice, you have representation. Why are you rioting when you can vote?" The existence of democratic processes was used to delegitimize popular resistance to oligarchic rule. This is sophisticated psychological control, far more effective than raw repression, though that was always available as a backup. By creating the appearance of democracy, the real oligarchy protected itself better than it ever could through violence alone. So when you picture yourself in a medieval common assembly, hundreds of people crowded into a guild hall, raising your hand to vote, think about what's really happening. You're not governing. You're watching a play where you're simultaneously audience member and prop, where your participation serves not to give you power, but to legitimize the power of those who already have it. And the worst part, on some level you probably know this, but what else can you do? Not participating just makes you irrelevant. Participating at least puts you in the room, even if the room is a stage set and your role is just to clap at the right moments. For most of this story, we've been talking about merchant guilds and the wealthy elite they represented. But there was another kind of guild, and their relationship with the merchant oligarchy tells us a lot about resistance power, and how systems change or don't change even when they're challenged. Craft guilds emerged in the 12th century as associations of artisans, people who actually made things. Weavers, fullers, bakers, butchers, carpenters, every skilled trade. These craftsmen had a serious grievance. They made the products that merchants sold, but merchants controlled the prices, taking most of the profit while craftsmen did all the work. Think about it from a craftsman's perspective. You're a weaver. You spend days creating beautiful cloth, skilled work that requires years of training. You sell it to a merchant guild member who turns around and sells it for 3 times what he paid you. Why? Because he controls access to markets, to customers, to distribution. He does none of the actual production but takes most of the reward, and when the merchant guild sets prices for cloth, they set both what they'll pay weavers and what they'll charge customers, ensuring their profit margin while squeezing the craftsmen who depend on them. The craft guilds formed to fight back against this exploitation. The earliest craft guilds in England were weavers and fullers, particularly in London, Lincoln and Oxford, established by around 1130. They sought royal recognition, charters that would give them autonomy from merchant guild control. They wanted to set their own quality standards, control who could work in their trades, and negotiate prices directly with customers. The merchant guilds fought this viciously. They used their political control of town governments to suppress craft guilds through regulations and legal harassment. They pressured kings not to grant charters to craft guilds. They spread the idea that craft guilds would lead to chaos, poor quality goods, economic collapse, anything to maintain their monopoly on trade. But craft guilds had one advantage. They were numerous. There were far more craftsmen than merchants. If they organised effectively, they could disrupt the entire urban economy. Weavers going on strike meant no cloth. Bakers refusing to work meant no bread. The threat of coordinated action by craftsmen gave them leverage merchants couldn't entirely ignore. Over 2 centuries, from roughly 1130 to 1335, craft guilds slowly won recognition in many towns. The breakthrough came with an unlikely ally, the king. In 1335, Edward III passed a statute allowing foreign merchants to trade freely in England. This might seem unrelated, but it was a death blow to merchant guild monopolies. If foreign merchants could trade without going through local merchant guilds, the guilds lost their stranglehold on urban economies. Why did Edward III do this? Money. Foreign trade meant more customs revenue for the crown. Merchant guilds had been gouging both foreign traders and the king, and Edward decided breaking their power served royal interests better than supporting them. With merchant guild monopolies weakened, craft guilds gained ground. They won the right to govern themselves, to elect their own wardens, to set standards for their trades. In some towns, craft guilds became powerful enough to demand representation on town councils. The social composition of urban government began to shift. But here's where the story gets complicated. Craft guilds, once they gained power, became their own oligarchies. They adopted the same restrictive practices merchant guilds had used. They limited who could join, kept apprenticeships expensive and lengthy, maintained quality standards that served to limit competition. They became monopolies just like the merchant guilds had been. The master craftsmen who controlled craft guilds were not interested in democracy or equality. They wanted their share of the oligarchic control. Instead of dismantling the system that oppressed them, they just wanted to join it, to become oppressors themselves. In Flanders during the 14th century, craftsmen went further. They actually rebelled, overthrew merchant governments in several cities, routed the French king who supported the merchants, and formed an alliance with the English king. This was a genuine revolution where craft guilds seized political power. But even this was unstable. The craft guild governments in Flanders were faction-ridden, violent, constantly at war internally between different guilds and externally with everyone else. Eventually, traditional authorities restored order, though craft guilds retained more power than before the revolts. The lesson seemed to be that craft guilds could win power through violence but couldn't maintain stable government. The usual outcome across England was compromise. Craft guilds shared town government with merchant guilds. Councils expanded to include representatives from major craft guilds. Some craft guild masters became aldermen and eventually mayors, but the system remained oligarchic. Instead of a small merchant elite ruling alone, it was a slightly larger elite of both merchants and master craftsmen ruling together. For journeymen and apprentices in craft guilds, for the majority of craftsmen who weren't masters, nothing changed. They were still exploited by guild masters, still denied political voice, still struggling to survive while the elite argued over how to divide power among themselves. The craft guild struggle reveals something important about medieval political economy. Opposition to oligarchy didn't mean opposition to oligarchy itself, just opposition to being excluded from it. The goal wasn't to create democracy or equality, but to get a seat at the table where decisions were made. Once craft guild masters achieved that, they lost interest in further change. There were a few exceptions. Some craft guilds maintained more egalitarian internal structures longer. Some tried to protect journeymen's interests as well as masters. But structural incentives pushed toward oligarchy. Masters had capital invested in shops and equipment. They employed others. Their interests aligned more with wealthy merchants than with their own workers. This is why revolutions against medieval urban oligarchies rarely succeeded. Not because they were violently suppressed, though they were, but because the people leading rebellions ultimately wanted to join the system, not overthrow it. Give craft guilds some power, co-opt their leaders into government, and suddenly they're defending the status quo instead of challenging it. The craft guild rebellions did achieve real changes. More people participated in urban governance, more trades had formal representation. Economic exploitation was somewhat reduced, though never eliminated. But the fundamental structure, oligarchic rule by wealthy guild masters with the rest of the population excluded, that persisted. If you were a journeyman weaver in 1400, your life might be marginally better than in 1300 because craft guilds had won some victories. But you still weren't voting for mayor. You still weren't on the council. Your master made decisions about your working conditions without consulting you. The craft guild that supposedly represented your trade was controlled by masters, who often cared more about their profits than your welfare. The story of craft guild rebellion is ultimately a story about how systems co-opt resistance. Give the opposition something, enough to satisfy their leaders, and they stop pushing for more. The system becomes more complex, with more layers and more competing interests, but it doesn't become more democratic or more equal. And that's how medieval urban oligarchies survive for centuries despite constant pressure from below. Not by never changing, but by changing just enough, just fast enough, to prevent the kind of revolutionary change that would threaten the fundamental distribution of power and wealth. We need to step back now and talk about something that's been implicit throughout this entire story, but deserves to be made explicit. Corruption wasn't a flaw in medieval urban governance. It wasn't a problem that reformers tried to fix. It was the system itself, how it was designed to function, the mechanism through which it operated. Modern people tend to think of corruption as aberrational. There are rules, and corrupt people break them for personal gain. We catch them, punish them, reinforce the rules, and the system continues. But medieval governance didn't work that way. The rules themselves were designed to enable what we'd call corruption, and the enforcement mechanisms were controlled by the same people who benefited from breaking those rules. Let's start with the concept of gifts. In medieval political culture, giving gifts was essential to maintaining relationships. You gave gifts to superiors to show respect, to peers to maintain alliances, to inferiors to display generosity. Gifts weren't bribes, they were expressions of honour and connection, except, of course, when they were bribes. The line between a gift and a bribe was never clear because it wasn't meant to be clear. Ambiguity served everyone's interests. Officials could accept payments while claiming they were merely respecting gift-giving customs. Petitioners could offer bribes while pretending they were just being properly respectful. Everyone knew what was really happening, but the fiction of gifts allowed corruption to function smoothly. Officials were deliberately paid very low salaries. This wasn't oversight, it was policy. The assumption was that officials would supplement their income through graft, through gifts, through creative use of their positions. This kept costs down for whoever was paying their salary, whether town government or the crown. and it ensured officials were motivated to be productive in their corruption, working hard to maximise the opportunities their position provided. But there were limits. Gifts were acceptable. Small-scale embezzlement was expected. Using your position to help family and friends was normal. These were perquisites of office, understood costs of doing business. What crossed the line was being too greedy, too obvious, threatening the functioning of the system itself. If a sheriff took bribes to ignore crimes but still maintained enough order that trade could function, that was fine. If he became so corrupt that trade broke down, that merchants couldn't operate, that violence spiraled out of control, then he'd become a problem. Not because corruption was bad, but because he damaged the system that provided his opportunity to be corrupt. This created a perverse incentive structure. Officials were rewarded for being efficiently corrupt. Take enough to get rich, but not so much that you break the system. Be discreet enough that common people don't riot, but everyone among the elite knows you're available for deals. Build a reputation for being reliably corrupt so people know they can work with you, but don't get so scandalous that you become a political liability. We see this in scandal cycles. A particularly corrupt official gets exposed, usually because he crossed some line and threatened someone more powerful. There's an investigation, a trial maybe. He's removed from office, fined, possibly imprisoned briefly. Everyone makes speeches about ending corruption and upholding justice. Then a few years later, he's back in government somewhere else, or his family members are, or his associates are. Because the investigation wasn't actually about ending corruption, it was about punishing this particular instance of corruption that had become problematic. The next official appointed to the position would be just as corrupt, just hopefully more discreet about it. Edward III's reign saw a major scandal in 1376. William Latimer, the King's Chamberlain, and Richard Lyons, involved in London's government and finance, were accused of massive corruption, taking bribes, embezzling funds, manipulating loans to charge usurious interest. Parliament prosecuted them, they were imprisoned. Alice Perrers, the King's mistress who'd been accused of manipulating him, was forced into exile. Victory for justice, right? 1 year later, Parliament's actions were undone. Latimer and Lyons were freed and returned to their positions. Perrers came back and reclaimed her properties. Why? Because Edward III wanted them back, and because the people who'd prosecuted them had lost political support, and because fundamentally the system needed corrupt officials to function. Consider why someone becomes a town official in medieval England. It's not about public service. The salary is terrible. The work is often tedious. So why do it? Because the position provides opportunities for enrichment that far exceed the salary. The right to collect fees and skim a percentage. Access to information about business opportunities before anyone else. The ability to award contracts to yourself and your allies. Power to punish enemies and reward friends. If you suddenly eliminated all corruption, made officials actually just serve their official functions for their official salaries, two things would happen. First, no one qualified would want the jobs. The elite certainly wouldn't bother. Second, government would cease functioning because it depended on officials having personal incentives to do their work. Medieval urban governance was a privatised system. Officials were essentially contractors who'd purchased or been granted a position, and were then authorised to exploit it for profit within certain bounds. The mayor didn't work for the town, he worked for himself using the authority the town granted him. Same with sheriffs, aldermen, all the rest. This is why anti-corruption efforts failed, not because reformers didn't try, but because the system couldn't function differently. You couldn't have professional bureaucracy with honest officials working for reasonable salaries in service of the public good. That concept didn't exist. Public good meant the elite profiting while maintaining enough order that commerce continued and taxes got paid. The great merchants who dominated urban politics were especially skilled at navigating and exploiting this system. They'd simultaneously be victims and perpetrators of corruption. Complaining loudly about some corrupt sheriff while bribing another one. Demanding reform of customs collection while evading the customs they owed. Using corruption accusations as weapons against rivals while being thoroughly corrupt themselves. Embezzlement of town funds was endemic. Town treasurers kept creative accounts. Money that came in wasn't always accounted for. Expenditures were inflated. False invoices were submitted. Funds earmarked for one purpose got diverted to another. Audit committees, when they existed, were staffed by the treasurer's friends and associates who weren't about to expose wrongdoing that might someday be turned against them. The genius of the system was that everyone was compromised. If you were in government at all, you were probably corrupt to some degree because that's how the system worked. This meant no one could credibly accuse anyone else without risking exposure of their own corruption. Mutually assured destruction kept everyone in line. For common people living under this system, it created a strange kind of cynicism. Everyone knew government was corrupt. It wasn't scandalous, it was just life. You expected to pay bribes for any interaction with officials. You expected that justice would favour the wealthy. You expected that laws would be applied selectively based on who you knew and what you could pay. This could breed either resignation or rage. Most people most of the time chose resignation because rage was dangerous and rarely productive. You worked within the system, paid the bribes you had to pay, called them gifts to maintain the fiction, tried to get by. Maybe occasionally you'd vent frustration by joining a mob when some particularly egregious scandal erupted, but then you'd go back to your daily life under corrupt governance. The rare corruption scandals that did lead to punishment served a valuable function for the system. They reinforced the idea that there were limits, that justice could function, that the system wasn't completely rotten. The sacrifice of one corrupt official, usually one who'd violated elite solidarity somehow, protected the corrupt system as a whole by providing the appearance that it could police itself. But of course it couldn't. Medieval urban oligarchies were structurally corrupt because they were oligarchies. When power is concentrated in a small, unaccountable elite, when those making rules are the same people benefiting from breaking them, when enforcement mechanisms are controlled by the corrupt officials being enforced against, you get systematic corruption that can't be reformed away without fundamentally changing the structure. This is the reality that history books often obscure. They'll mention individual corrupt officials as colourful characters. They'll note scandals as dramatic events. But they often miss that corruption was structural, that it was the system working as designed, not the system breaking down. Understanding this transforms how you see medieval urban life. Every transaction, every interaction with authority, every legal proceeding, every political process, all of it operating on a foundation of systematic corruption that everyone knows about, but no one can effectively challenge. That's the world you're falling asleep in tonight. We need to talk about violence, not war, not the dramatic battles and sieges that history focuses on. The daily, mundane, institutionalized violence that maintained social control in medieval towns. Because everything we've discussed, the merchant oligarchies, the guild monopolies, the corrupt officials, all of it ultimately rested on the threat and reality of physical harm. Public punishment was theatre. It was designed to be seen, to be memorable, to be feared. When someone was convicted of a crime, their punishment would take place in the marketplace, the busiest, most public space in town. Maximum visibility, maximum impact on observers. The stocks and pillory were wooden restraints that immobilized you in an uncomfortable position. Stocks locked your ankles while you sat or lay on the ground. Pillory locked your head and hands while you stood. You'd be left there for hours or days, exposed to weather and to the crowd. People threw things. Rotten vegetables, mud, excrement, rocks. You couldn't dodge, couldn't protect yourself. Children learned early to participate in this public shaming. Parents would bring them to watch, sometimes giving them things to throw, teaching them that this is what happens when you break the rules, this is what authority can do to you. Some people in the stocks were seriously injured. Rocks to the head could kill. Even vegetables could cause damage if thrown hard enough. Guards might or might not intervene depending on whether they thought you deserved protection or additional suffering. Sometimes people in the stocks were pelted so severely they died, and it would be ruled accidental, just community justice getting a bit enthusiastic. Whipping was common for more serious offences. You'd be stripped to the waist, tied to a post or a cart and whipped with a knotted cord or leather strap. The sheriff or his designee would do it. The number of strokes was specified by the court, but the vigour behind each stroke was up to the executioner, a light. Whipping might leave you bruised and painful but able to work in a few days. A serious whipping could flay skin off your back, leaving permanent scars, causing infection that might kill you, and you never knew which you'd get until it started. The uncertainty was part of the punishment, the terror of not knowing whether this would be bearable or unbearable. Branding was another favourite. Heating a metal brand and pressing it into your skin, usually your hand or forehead. The burn was agonising, the scar permanent. Everyone who saw you afterward would know you'd been convicted of something. The brand marked you as criminal forever, limiting what work you could find, who would do business with you, where you could go. For theft, you might lose a hand, literally. Public amputation, cutting off the hand that stole with an axe or sword, cauterizing the wound with hot tar to prevent immediate death from bleeding. If infection didn't kill you, you lived maimed, unable to do many types of work, marked physically as a thief forever. For certain crimes, ears were cut off. For others, your tongue might be split or removed. The punishment was calibrated to the crime in symbolic ways. Liars had their tongues mutilated. Thieves lost hands. Those who resisted authority might be mutilated in ways that demonstrated authority's power over their bodies. Execution was reserved for serious crimes, but was common enough. Hanging was the usual method. Public, of course. The gallows would be set up in the marketplace or on the edge of town where roads met, visible from a distance as a warning. The condemned would be led through the streets, possibly beaten along the way, definitely mocked and pelted by crowds. The actual hanging was often botched. The drop method that breaks the neck and causes quick death was developed later. Medieval hangings usually involved slow strangulation, the condemned choking to death over minutes while their body thrashed and evacuated its bowels and bladder. Crowds watched this, learned from it, internalized the lesson that this is what happens when you cross the power structure too severely. For particularly heinous crimes, worse deaths were available: burning at the stake for heresy, drawing and quartering for treason, where you'd be hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while alive, then cut into pieces. These spectacles drew enormous crowds. People would travel from surrounding villages to watch. It was entertainment as much as punishment, a day's outing to see someone die horribly. But here's the thing about all this violence: it wasn't applied equally, not even close. Who got punished depended entirely on who you were and who you knew. Wealthy merchants rarely faced physical punishment. When they were convicted, which was rare since they controlled the courts, they'd pay fines. Large fines, perhaps, enough to make a point, but just money. Their bodies remained inviolate. Physical punishment was for the poor, for those without. Protection, for outsiders. If a rich merchant's son assaulted someone, there might be a settlement, a payment to the victim, maybe a stern talking to. If a poor labourer did the same thing, he'd be whipped publicly, possibly branded, possibly worse. The law was theoretically the same for both, but enforcement was utterly different. This created a two-tiered justice system. For the wealthy, law was something they navigated through lawyers and bribes and connections, and punishments were financial. For the poor, law was something that happened to them violently, without recourse, without mercy. We see this in recorded cases. In Arras, a woman was raped in broad daylight with witnesses. The rapist's friends bribed the corrupt chief of police, and all charges were dropped. The woman had no recourse. Violence against her didn't matter because she wasn't wealthy or connected enough for her assault to be prosecuted. Meanwhile, in the same town, a man was executed for stealing bread. Not because theft mattered more than rape, but because he'd stolen from someone with connections who demanded punishment. The law responded to power, not to justice. This selective enforcement served a purpose beyond just protecting the elite. It reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. If you were poor and you saw wealth exempting people from violence while poverty guaranteed it, you learned that achieving wealth was your only path to security. This reinforced the economic order. Everyone scrambled to accumulate money not just for material comfort, but for physical safety. The psychology of living under this system was corrosive. You knew that justice was a lie, that law was a weapon used against the weak, that your body was vulnerable in ways that wealthy people's bodies weren't. You knew that if someone powerful wanted to destroy you, they could arrange for your arrest on false charges, your conviction in a rigged court, your punishment in the marketplace. This created pervasive fear. Not constant terror, people couldn't live in that state continuously. But a background awareness that violence could erupt at any time, that authority could decide you were a problem, and there'd be nothing you could do about it. This fear was a form of control as effective as actual violence, maybe more so because it was always present, always possible. And yet, somehow, life continued. People worked, loved, raised children, laughed, celebrated under these conditions. Human adaptability is remarkable and tragic. You can normalize almost anything if it's constant enough. Public executions become just part of the landscape. Corruption becomes the water you swim in. Violence becomes a routine threat you navigate around. But the system wanted you to watch. That's why punishment was public. They needed everyone to see what happened to people who broke rules, who challenged authority, who stepped out of line. The violence wasn't just about punishing the specific individual, it was about educating everyone else. So think about being in that marketplace crowd, watching someone whipped or branded or hanged. Maybe you know them. Maybe they're guilty of what they're accused of, maybe not. But you watch and you learn. You internalize the lesson. You become complicit in your own control through witnessing and accepting the violence that could, at any moment, be directed at you. That's how power really worked in medieval towns. Not through grand political theories or legal philosophies. Through the simple, brutal fact that those in charge could hurt you physically, publicly, without consequence. And everyone knew it. Now let's talk about the people who didn't accept it. Because despite everything we've discussed, despite the overwhelming power of urban oligarchies and the violence enforcing their rule, there was resistance. Common people fought back in various ways with varying degrees of success. Understanding how resistance worked, and mostly didn't work, tells us as much about the system as understanding how control functioned. Resistance took many forms. Often it was subtle, individual, barely noticeable. A craftsman would quietly violate guild regulations when he thought he could get away with it. A merchant would underreport income to reduce taxes. A servant would steal food from their employer. Small acts of defiance that chipped away at elite control without directly challenging it. There were also collective but peaceful methods. Petitions were common. Groups of townspeople would draft complaints about some official's behaviour, some regulations' unfairness, some taxes' burden. They'd present these petitions to the mayor, to aldermen, sometimes even to the king's courts, if they could afford to send representatives. Most petitions were ignored. The people receiving them were the people being complained about, or their allies. But occasionally, when the complaint touched on something that served elite factional interests, action might be taken. If one group of elites wanted to damage another group, a petition from common people could provide useful ammunition. The hue and cry was another tool. When crime occurred, anyone could raise the hue and cry, yelling to alert the neighbourhood. Everyone was legally obligated to help pursue the criminal. But this mechanism could be weaponized against officials. If a sheriff or his men were doing something the community opposed, someone might raise the hue and cry, mobilizing collective action that looked legitimate because it used official procedures. Historian Christopher Fletcher has written about how disenfranchised urban populations used communal policing mechanisms to criticize civic leaders. It was a way of turning the system's own tools against it, but it was risky. Officials could, and did, retaliate against people who used these methods to challenge them. Disrupting civic rituals was another tactic. When the mayor was inducted or some ceremony occurred, common people were expected to attend and show support. But what if they didn't? What if they attended but stood silent instead of cheering? What if they made their displeasure visible through body language and minimal compliance? These disruptions rarely stopped the rituals, but they sent a message. They demonstrated that consent was not genuine, that the appearance of popular support was hollow. For authorities who depended on performative legitimacy, this could be destabilizing. Tax resistance was perhaps the most common form of collective resistance, simply refusing to pay, or delaying payment, or paying less than demanded. Individually, this was dangerous, but if large numbers did it simultaneously, authorities faced a dilemma. They couldn't arrest everyone. Mass enforcement would require military force, which might not be available, or might trigger worse unrest. So sometimes, demands would be reduced or delayed, but usually resistance stayed beneath the threshold that would provoke violent response. People pushed back within limits, testing boundaries, gaining small concessions, but not threatening the fundamental structure. When resistance did turn violent, it was usually triggered by food scarcity, or particularly egregious corruption. Food riots were common throughout medieval Europe. When grain prices spiked because merchants were hoarding, when bread became unaffordable, people would riot. They'd break into warehouses, seize grain, sometimes destroy property of merchants they blamed. These riots were spontaneous eruptions of desperation. Starving people have nothing to lose. Authorities would respond with violence, restoring order through force, executing ringleaders as examples. but they'd also sometimes release grain stores, lower prices temporarily, make concessions to prevent further unrest. Food riots could work in the immediate term, even if they didn't change underlying systems. Attacks on particularly hated officials did happen. Tax collectors were beaten, occasionally killed. Corrupt sheriffs might be ambushed. Properties of the wealthy might be burned. These attacks were usually carried out by crowds or at night when individuals could avoid identification. Direct violence against authority was incredibly dangerous, so it required mob cover or anonymity. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the most famous large-scale uprising in medieval England. Though it was primarily rural, it affected towns too. When rebels entered London, they specifically targeted corrupt officials. They found Richard Lyons, that corrupt financial official we mentioned earlier, and beheaded him in the street. They went after the Archbishop of Canterbury and several other high officials, executing them. This wasn't random violence. The rebels had specific grievances against specific people. They were seeking justice through extra legal means because legal channels had failed. Of course, the revolt was crushed, its leaders executed and the system restored, but it had terrified the elite and led to some reforms, some reduction in the most oppressive taxes, some caution about pushing common people too far. The problem with violent resistance was that it usually failed. The elite had resources that common people didn't. They could hire armed men. They could call on royal military forces. They had fortified buildings to retreat to, and they had legal authority to declare resistors as criminals and rebels, allowing harsh suppression to be framed as legitimate law enforcement. Even when rebellion succeeded temporarily, in taking a town or driving out officials, they couldn't hold power. Rebels lacked the administrative machinery to govern. They lacked the economic networks to keep trade flowing. They lacked recognition from external authorities. Eventually, usually quickly, traditional powers would reassert control. The craft guild rebellions we discussed earlier were the most successful form of resistance because they had organisation, resources, and clear objectives. They weren't trying to overthrow the system, but to gain a share of power within it. That made them capable of sustained pressure, and also made them acceptable as negotiating partners to existing elites. But for common people outside guilds, for the poor and marginalised, resistance options were limited and mostly ineffective. You could refuse to show up to assemblies, but assemblies continued without you. You could complain through petitions that were ignored. You could participate in riots that got crushed. You could attack an official who'd be replaced by someone just as corrupt. The fundamental problem was that you couldn't overthrow a system when you depended on that system for survival. You needed the town economy to function, to have work. You needed the grain merchants to bring food even if they charged too much. You needed the system, even as the system exploited you. This dependence limited how far resistance could go. Authorities understood this. They knew that as long as people could survive, could feed their families, could harbour small hopes for improvement, major rebellion was unlikely. So they'd calibrate oppression to stay beneath the threshold that would trigger mass uprising. Push people hard, extract maximum wealth and labour, but leave them just enough to survive and just enough hope to make resistance seem riskier than compliance. When people did rebel, when food riots or protests erupted, authorities would crush them but also ask, did we push too hard? Should we ease off temporarily? Often they would, reducing the worst abuses for a time, until pressure was forgotten and they could start pushing again. This cycle of oppression, resistance, violent suppression, temporary concession, and renewed oppression repeated throughout medieval urban history. Neither side could fully win. Authorities couldn't eliminate resistance without eliminating the people they depended on for labour and taxes. Common people couldn't overthrow authorities without destroying the economic and political structures they needed to survive. So you lived in this equilibrium, mostly accepting the system because fighting it was dangerous and usually futile. Occasionally pushing back when something became intolerable. Sometimes winning small victories that made life slightly more bearable. Mostly just enduring, surviving, trying to protect yourself and your family as best you could under oligarchic rule. And sometimes, lying in your bed at night, you'd think about resistance, about what you could do, might do, should do. But morning would come and you'd have work, bills, family depending on you. So you'd put your head down and get through another day. That's how systems perpetuate themselves. Not through total control, but through making resistance feel too risky, too futile, too dangerous compared to simple survival. That's the reality of resistance in medieval towns. mostly small, mostly failed, occasionally achieving something, but never enough to fundamentally change who held power and how they wielded it. Let's bring all of this together now by imagining what daily life actually felt like for an ordinary person living in a medieval English town under this system. Because we've talked about power structures, corruption, violence, resistance. But what did it mean day to day, hour to hour, to live in this world? You wake up before dawn. There's no clock, but you've learned to judge time by light through your window. You need to be at work early because guild regulations specify when you can start, and the wardens will fine you if you're late opening your shop or slow getting to your master's workshop. Before you leave, there's the morning meal, bread if you have it, probably a bit stale. Maybe some ale, safer than water from the well that everyone suspects is contaminated, but no one can afford to avoid. Your family eats little because food is expensive and every penny must be stretched. Heading to work, you navigate streets that are muddy, filthy, cluttered. Waste gets thrown into the street, animal and human. The constables are supposed to enforce cleaning, but enforcement is sporadic. You step carefully, trying not to ruin your shoes, which you can't afford to replace. At work, whether you're a journeyman in someone's shop or running your own small business, you're thinking about regulations. So many regulations. The quality of your work must meet guild standards, but those standards are enforced arbitrarily, depending on whether the guild wardens like you. If you're not well connected, they might reject work that would be fine from a master's son. Every transaction is regulated. Prices aren't really set by you and your customers. The guild has determined what things should cost. If you charge less, you're undercutting and you'll be punished. Charge more, same problem. You have to hit the exact price the guild set, which might not be what your work is worth. Throughout the day, you're aware of authority, constables, walking through checking that everyone's working legally, sheriffs collecting fees and fines, guild officials inspecting workshops. You never know when someone with power might decide you're a problem, so you're always careful, always deferential, always ready to justify what you're doing. At midday you eat again if you can afford it. Maybe bread and cheese from a market stall. The bread must meet size standards, which are supposed to ensure quality, but actually just enable the Bakers Guild to control competition. The cheese is expensive because the merchants who import it have a monopoly. Everything costs more than it should because middlemen take cuts at every step. Afternoon continues like morning. Work under watchful eyes, following rules you didn't make, that don't serve your interests, but that you must obey or face punishment. You hear about someone who got fined for violating some regulation. You hear about someone who bribed the right official and got away with worse violations. You file that information away. Maybe someday you'll need to know who to bribe. The marketplace is busy. You see the wealth disparity vividly. Wealthy merchants in fine clothes, attended by servants, conducting large transactions. Aldermen walking with authority, people deferring to them. And then there are people like you, dressed in worn clothes, struggling to make ends meet, hoping not to be noticed by anyone important. Evening comes and you return home. You're exhausted, not just from physical labour, but from the constant vigilance required to navigate a system designed to extract from you. You eat a simple supper with your family. The children ask questions you can't really answer. Why can't we have nicer things? Why does father have to work so hard? Why do the rich men get to decide everything? You don't have good answers. This is just how it is, you say. Maybe someday it'll be better for them. You don't really believe that, but you have to tell them something. At night, if there's a ward mote or common assembly, you might attend. You go partly because absence is noticed and might be interpreted as disloyalty. You sit with hundreds of others in the guild hall listening to the alderman or mayor announce decisions that have already been made. You might be asked to approve something. You raise your hand with everyone else. What choice do you have? Walking home in the dark is dangerous. There's no street lighting. Criminals operate, and you can't trust that constables will help you. You stay on main streets, walk quickly, avoid eye contact with anyone who looks threatening. You make it home safely this time. Not everyone does. Before sleep, you think about your life. You're not starving, which is something. You have work, shelter, family. Many have less. But you're also not advancing. Your father was a journeyman, you're a journeyman, your son will probably be a journeyman. Breaking into the masterclass requires connections and money you don't have. You think about the mayor and aldermen getting wealthier while you struggle. You think about the guild masters who control your profession, setting rules that benefit them at your expense. You think about the corruption everyone knows about but no one can stop. You think about the violence that awaits anyone who challenges the system too openly. And you think about whether any of this will ever change. Probably not in your lifetime. Probably not in your children's lifetime. This is just the world you live in. The powerful dominate, the rest survive as best they can. Some nights you lie awake longer, fantasizing about different possibilities. What if the common people organised, really organised, and refused to work until things changed? What if the craft guilds united and seized town government? What if enough people got angry enough that they overwhelmed the sheriffs and their armed men? But these fantasies fade as you remember the consequences of past rebellions, hangings, burnings, whole families destroyed. The system is too strong, too entrenched, too willing to use violence, and you have too much to lose, even if you don't have much. So you turn over, adjust your thin blanket, listen to your family breathing nearby, and try to find sleep. Tomorrow will be another day of the same. Work, regulations, authority, careful navigation of a system that doesn't care about you. But you'll survive, you'll endure, because that's what ordinary people do under oligarchic rule. They survive. This is the daily reality we wanted you to understand. Not dramatic rebellions or grand political theories, just the grinding experience of living in a society where power is concentrated, where corruption is systematic, where violence enforces hierarchy, and where your options are limited to compliance, survival, and small acts of resistance that rarely change anything. That's what medieval urban life actually meant for most people. Before we close, we should acknowledge that not every medieval town fit this pattern exactly. There were exceptions, places where different arrangements developed, where power was more distributed or exercised differently. Understanding these exceptions helps us see why they remained exceptions, and why the oligarchic model dominated. Some free imperial cities in the Holy Roman Empire developed more participatory governance. These were cities that owed allegiance directly to the emperor rather than to local princes or bishops. Because the emperor was distant and often distracted by larger political concerns, these cities had considerable autonomy. Some developed systems where broader segments of the population participated in elections and governance. Nuremberg, for example, had a complex system where multiple guilds shared power, with elaborate checks and balances preventing any single group from dominating completely. It wasn't democratic in modern terms, but it distributed power more widely than the typical English town oligarchy. Venice is perhaps the most famous exception. The Venetian Republic was ruled by a doge, elected for life by an elaborate system designed to prevent any faction from controlling the process. The Great Council, eventually numbering over 1,000 members, represented wealthy families but included more people in governance than most medieval cities. Venice maintained this system for centuries, becoming one of the most stable and prosperous medieval states. The Hanseatic League cities of northern Europe also had more distributed power in some cases. These were merchant cities that formed a trading alliance spanning much of northern Europe. Because they depended on cooperation between many independent merchants, they couldn't afford to have governance completely dominated by a small clique. Power-sharing arrangements were necessary for the League to function. Why did these alternatives develop? Usually because of specific circumstances that made oligarchic consolidation difficult. Geographic isolation, as with Venice. Political autonomy from nearby lords, as with free imperial cities. Economic structures requiring cooperation, as with Hanseatic cities. When these circumstances existed, different governance models became possible, but England didn't have these circumstances, at least not as widely. English towns were under royal authority ultimately, even if that authority was delegated. They weren't as geographically isolated. Their economies were controlled by merchant guilds that had successfully monopolized trade, so the oligarchic model dominated. There were also attempts at reform within English towns. The most famous is probably the Jubilee Book of London from 1376. This document attempted to reform London's government, establishing clearer procedures, reducing corruption, ensuring better representation. It was quite detailed, describing civic roles, oaths of office, the structure of municipal power. The reforms were too controversial. They threatened too many entrenched interests. By 1387, just 11 years later, the Jubilee Book was rejected and actually publicly burned. The old system was restored. Attempts at fundamental reform failed because those with power to implement reform were the ones who benefited from the status quo. Other reform movements met similar fates across medieval England. Temporary improvements might be achieved. A particularly corrupt official might be removed. Some regulation might be passed limiting specific abuses. But structural change, real redistribution of power that didn't happen through reform, the Black Death of 1348 to 1350, did force changes, though not through anyone's reform efforts. The pandemic killed between 30 and 60% of England's population. This demographic catastrophe fundamentally altered the balance of power between labour and capital. With fewer workers available, wages rose dramatically. Peasants and labourers could demand better conditions because their labour was suddenly scarce and valuable. In towns, this meant craft workers had more leverage. Guilds still controlled the trades, but masters had to compete for journeymen and apprentices who now had options. Regulations loosened somewhat because strict enforcement would drive needed workers away. Food prices fell relative to wages because fewer mouths needed feeding. The feudal system, already declining, essentially ended as a practical matter. The relationship between lord and vassal became more like landlord and tenant, a monetary relationship rather than an obligation of service. In towns, this meant the oligarchies had to be somewhat more flexible, somewhat less oppressive to keep their economies functioning. But notice what didn't change: the fundamental structure. There were still mayors elected from merchant elites, still aldermen serving for life, still guilds controlling trades, still corruption and violence and hierarchy. The system adapted to the new demographic reality, but didn't transform into something fundamentally different. Over the following 2 centuries, as population recovered, many of the post-plague gains were eroded. Wages fell again. Conditions worsened. Oligarchies consolidated power. The system proved remarkably resilient, capable of bending when it had to, but never breaking. Guilds persisted into the early modern period. In England, Henry VIII suppressed thousands of guilds in the 1530s and 1540s during the Reformation, seizing their assets and redistributing them. But this wasn't about ending oligarchic control. It was about transferring power and wealth from guild-controlled institutions to crown-controlled ones. The king's auditors inspected every guild, seized religious properties and funds, and forced guilds to pay large sums to continue operating. Many guilds survived this and continued functioning for another century or more. The livery companies of London, successors to medieval craft guilds, still exist today as ceremonial organisations. They lost their monopolistic economic power, but only gradually, only as broader economic changes made that power impossible to maintain. The lesson from these exceptions and reform attempts is that fundamental change was incredibly difficult. Systems of power, once established, defend themselves. Those who benefit from them resist change. Those who suffer under them often lack the resources to force change. External shocks like plagues can create opportunities, but even then, systems adapt rather than transform. For you, living in a typical medieval English town, these exceptions might as well not exist. You're not in Venice or Nuremberg. You're in York or Bristol or any of dozens of smaller towns following the oligarchic model. Reform movements happen elsewhere or fail here. The Black Death was catastrophic and brought some improvements, but the fundamental structure of your town's governance remains unchanged. Your reality is oligarchic rule, systematic corruption, selective violence, limited options, for resistance, and daily life, navigating a system designed to benefit a small elite at everyone else's expense. That's the world you know, the only world you're likely to see. And that's the truth we wanted you to understand tonight. So here we are, at the end of our journey through medieval English town governance. Let's step back and see the full picture we've painted tonight. Medieval towns were not ruled by kings or distant nobles. They were ruled by merchant oligarchies, small groups of wealthy traders and guild masters who controlled every lever of power. The mayor, aldermen, sheriffs, guild wardens. They were all drawn from the same elite class, often from the same families generation after generation. Democracy was performance art. Common assemblies existed, votes were held, but real decisions were made in private chambers by men who'd already determined the outcomes. The appearance of popular consent legitimised oligarchic rule without actually transferring power to common people. Corruption wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system itself. Officials were paid low salaries and expected to supplement income through graft. Gifts and bribes were indistinguishable. Embezzlement was standard practice. The rules were written by people who benefited from breaking them, and enforcement was controlled by the corrupt. Violence maintained the hierarchy. Public punishment, brutal and visible, taught everyone what happened when you stepped out of line. But this violence was applied selectively. Wealthy people paid fines. Poor people lost hands, ears, sometimes lives. Justice served power, not fairness. Economic control reinforced political control. Merchant guilds monopolized trade. Craft guilds controlled who could work in each trade. Prices were fixed, competition eliminated, and wealth concentrated in elite hands. You couldn't succeed economically without acceptance from those who already had power. The church supported this system while sometimes competing with it. Religious authorities sanctified social hierarchy, teaching that obedience was virtue and that God ordained the existing order. Church courts, church property, church charity all served to maintain control, even as individual clergy might be as corrupt as secular officials. Resistance existed, but mostly failed. Petitions were ignored, riots were crushed, rebellions were suppressed. Even successful movements like craft guild campaigns for power resulted in co-option rather than transformation. The system proved remarkably resilient, adapting when necessary but never fundamentally changing. Daily life under this system was an endless navigation of rules you didn't make, authorities you didn't choose, and violence you couldn't escape. You worked hard, followed regulations, paid bribes disguised as gifts, and hoped you'd never become the target of someone powerful enough to destroy you. This is the reality of medieval urban governance that textbooks often sanitize. They talk about charters and assemblies and make it sound orderly, even progressive. They miss or downplay the systematic oppression, the casual corruption, the routine violence, the complete concentration of power in the hands of a small, unaccountable elite. Why does this matter now, hundreds of years later? Because understanding historical power structures helps us recognize them in our own time. The specific forms change, the rhetoric evolves, but patterns of oligarchic control, systematic corruption, performative democracy, and selective violence recur throughout history. When you see wealth concentrating in ever fewer hands, when you notice that rules seem to apply differently to different people, when democratic processes seem to produce predetermined outcomes regardless of how people vote, when justice appears selective, you're seeing echoes of these medieval patterns. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how power works, how systems perpetuate themselves, how ordinary people are controlled, and how they resist. The specific details change, but the fundamental dynamics often don't. The medieval townspeople whose lives we've explored tonight weren't stupid or passive. They were navigating a system that gave them few options, that punished resistance harshly, that had been optimized over centuries to extract wealth and labour while preventing organised opposition. They did resist in various ways: small acts of defiance, collective petitions, occasional riots, long campaigns by craft guilds for representation. Sometimes they achieved small victories, marginal improvements in their conditions. Mostly they survived, which in itself was an accomplishment in such a difficult world. And over centuries, very slowly, things did change. Not because oligarchs suddenly became generous, not because reform movements succeeded, but because larger forces like plagues, economic changes, religious upheavals, and eventually political revolutions transformed society in ways that made the old arrangements unsustainable. Your medieval town eventually gave way to something different, not necessarily better in all ways, certainly not perfectly just or equal, but different. The guilds lost their monopolies, the merchant oligarchies fragmented, new forms of economic and political organisation emerged. The process took centuries and was neither linear nor guaranteed. But that's a different story for a different night. Tonight, we wanted you to understand the truth behind medieval urban governance. Not the romanticised version of charming market towns and wise mayors, the real version of systematic exploitation, casual corruption, routine violence, and oligarchic control. We wanted you to see how power actually functioned when there were no checks on it, no democratic accountability, no separation of powers, no independent judiciary. When the same small group of men controlled the economy, the government, the courts, and the enforcement mechanisms. We wanted you, to understand what ordinary people experienced living under that system. Not just the material poverty, though that was real, but the psychological weight of powerlessness, of knowing that your life could be destroyed by someone wealthy enough to manipulate the system, of having no voice, no vote, no recourse that mattered. And we wanted you to see how remarkably similar some of these patterns are to power dynamics throughout history, and even in various forms today. So if you've made it this far, if you're still awake or drifting peacefully off to sleep with history swirling through your mind, thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this revealing, go ahead and give it a like. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into history's darker, more honest corners. And drop a comment telling me which aspect of medieval urban control shocked you most, or what you'd like me to explore next. Now, as we bring tonight to a close, let yourself relax completely. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let go of the tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. Breathe slowly and deeply, in and out. You've learned something tonight. You've peered behind the curtain of medieval history and seen the machinery of power operating in all its corrupt, violent, oligarchic reality. That knowledge is yours now. Use it however you wish. But for now, for this moment, just let it all drift away. Let the images of medieval streets and marketplaces fade. Let the names and dates and details dissolve into the background. Let history carry you gently into sleep. The past is past. You're safe here, warm and comfortable, far removed from medieval towns and their oligarchic rulers. Tomorrow is another day with its own challenges and opportunities, but for now, just rest. Good night. Sleep well. And thank you for exploring the dark truth of medieval England with me. See you in the next one.